Good evening. Welcome to Heavy D Storytelling. I'm David Sneed, and I'm going to tell you a story tonight. We are reading the Neverending Story, but first I'm going to start with Genesis. And we did not read yesterday, so that was the fourth. And today is the fifth. So I'm going to read Genesis chapters 4 and 5 today. That's going to be a lot of those names that I'll have to hopefully be able to pronounce. But we'll just get started with it and see how I do. All right. So this is Genesis chapter 4 in the English Standard Version. Oh, let me give you a copy and paste. Give you I don't know if anybody follows along on their Bible Hub app, but you can do that. I just sent you a link. There it is. All right. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain worked a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord said to him, Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mehujael, and Mehujael fathered Methushael, and Methushael fathered Lamech. And Lamech took two wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. Zillah also bore Tubal-Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. And now we're moving on to chapter 5, since today is the 5th of July. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Adam that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel. I missed a syllable. Kenan lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years. Hi, Rebecca. And he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he fathered Jared. Mahalalel lived after he fathered Jared 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Jared lived after he fathered Enoch 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he fathered Lamech. Methuselah lived after he fathered Lamech 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son and called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. Lamech lived after he fathered Noah 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And that's where we will end Genesis today. Tomorrow we'll do Genesis chapter 6, which, as many of you know, is the beginning of the flood chapters in the book of Genesis. So, let me find this. Okay. Now we are going to read the Neverending Story, but first I've got Kimberly here, who is ready to give us the synopsis of what happened when Atreyu went to go meet the sheep-goat farmer. Is that who he met in the last chapter? I'm assuming by your expression that I remembered that chapter incorrectly. Maybe you can fill us in and let us know what actually happened.
Okay, fine. So what happened was Atreyu, he went over and saw the childlike empress, and she basically said, he's here, the human is here, you brought him along with your story, but he doesn't, and he knows what to do, he doesn't exactly get what to do, or something like that, I don't know. The truth was, he wasn't really understanding what he should do. So, the childlike empress leaves two of her invisible servants to basically heal Falkor and Atreyu. So what happens after that is the other four of the childlike empress's attendants, her invisible attendants, they go over and she's gonna meet this person who's kind of like her, and he's like the Lord of the Mountain or something like that. And apparently he he writes down stories, whether good or bad. And that's about where we are. And apparently, also, the childlike empress ran into a few patches of the nothing on her way, but she didn't get hurt at all. Hey, Dad, I finished.
You're all done?
Yeah, ready. I know you saying stuff like, and the castle blew up, and blah blah blah. It's a lot faster.
Oh. But I thought
And
that
also, we only did one chapter.
we did only do one chapter. And so now they're going to go to the old woman that lives in a shoe. Okay, is Daniel doing his thing that he wanted to do? Daniel? Okay, so we have a new thing that is, I'm hoping that it continues. So Daniel and JJ are here for the day.
I need to find a good one. 1 second.
1 second. It's from a joke book that
You need to
Rebecca
hurry up.
Sneeden got
Okay, sorry.
for his birthday.
Just pick one. You can find one now and have one that you deliberately pick. Just pick one that's on that page.
What do you get when you cross a lemon and a cat?
I don't know, what do you get when you cross a lemon and a cat?
A sourpuss.
That was funny. Okay, and so tomorrow when we have joke time with Daniel, yay! Okay, so I have to find my book again. I've got too many windows open, so that's what makes it confusing. Okay, excuse me. All right, the old man, this is chapter 12, of Wandering Mountain. And the first letter is, has anybody figured out the pattern? Oh, Ben's smart. Okay. First letter is L. Long thundering avalanches descended from the heights. Snowstorms raged between towering ice-coated summits, dipped into hollows and ravines, and swept howling onward over the great white expanse of the glaciers. Such weather was not at all unusual for this part of the country, for the Mountain of Destiny, that was its name, was the highest in all Fantastica, and its peak literally jutted into the heights of heaven. Not even the most intrepid mountain climbers ventured into these fields of everlasting ice. Just a minute. Hey, I'm hearing some talking going on over here, okay? If y'all want to talk about what jokes you want to tell tomorrow, then y'all can talk about it when we're not doing the live stream. Got it? Okay, put the book down. It's time for you to listen now. JJ, you either need to be in your room or you need to lay down on my bed, okay? Lost my place. Not even the most intrepid mountain climbers ventured into these fields of everlasting ice. Just 1 minute. I'm back. I'm also front. It had been so very, very long since anyone had succeeded in climbing this mountain that the feat had been forgotten. For one of Fantastica's many strange laws decreed that no one could climb the Mountain of Destiny until the last successful climber had been utterly forgotten. Thus, anyone who managed to climb it would always be the first. No living creature could survive in that icy waste, except for a handful of gigantic ice clumps who could barely be called living creatures, for they moved so slowly that they needed years for a single step and whole centuries for a short walk, which meant, of course, that they could only associate with their own kind and knew nothing at all about the rest of Fantastica. They thought of themselves as the only living creatures in the universe. Consequently, they were puzzled to the point of consternation when they saw a tiny speck twining its way upward over perilous crags and razor-sharp ridges, then vanishing into deep chasms and crevasses, only to reappear higher up. That speck was the childlike Empress's glass litter, still carried by four of her invisible powers. It was barely visible, for the glass it was made of looked very much like ice, and the childlike Empress's white gown and white hair could hardly be distinguished from the snow round about. She had traveled many days and nights. The four powers had carried her through blinding rain and scorching sun, through darkness and moonlight, onward and onward, just as she had ordered, no matter where. She was prepared for a long journey and all manner of hardships, since she knew that the old man of Wandering Mountain could be everywhere or nowhere. Still, the four invisible powers were not guided entirely by chance in their choice of an itinerary. As often as not, the nothing, which had already swallowed up whole regions, left only a single path open. Sometimes the possibilities narrowed down to a bridge, a tunnel, or a gateway, and sometimes they were forced to carry the litter with the deathly ill Empress over the waves of the sea. These carriers saw no difference between liquid and solid, tireless and persevering. They had finally reached the frozen heights of the mountain of destiny, and they would go on climbing until the childlike Empress gave them another order. But she lay still on her cushions. Her eyes were closed and she said nothing. The last words she had spoken were the no matter where she had said on leaving the ivory tower. The litter was moving through a deep ravine so narrow that there was barely room for it to pass. The snow was several feet deep, but the invisible carriers did not sink in or even leave footprints. It was very dark at the bottom of the ravine, which admitted only a narrow strip of daylight. The path was on a steady incline, and the higher the litter climbed, the nearer the daylight seemed. And then suddenly the walls leveled off, opening up a view of the vast white expanse. This was the summit, for the mountain of destiny culminated not, like most other mountains, in a single peak, but in this high plateau, which was as large as a whole country. But then, surprisingly enough, a smaller, odd-looking mountain arose in the midst of the plateau. It was rather tall and narrow, something like the ivory tower, but glittering blue. It consisted of innumerable strangely shaped stone teeth, which jutted into the sky like great inverted icicles, and about halfway up the mountain, three such teeth supported an egg the size of a house. Behind the egg, large blue columns resembling the pipes of an enormous organ rose in a semicircle. The great egg had a circular opening which might have been a door or a window, and in that opening a face appeared. The face was looking straight at the litter. The childlike Empress opened her eyes. Stop, she said softly. Sorry, I didn't say that softly, did I? Stop, she said softly. The invisible powers stopped. The childlike Empress sat up. It's the old man of Wandering Mountain, she said. I must go to the last stretch of the way alone. Whatever may happen, wait for me here. The face in the circular opening vanished. The childlike Empress stepped out of the litter and started across the great snowfield. It was hard going, for she was barefooted and there was an icy crust on the snow. At every step she broke through, and the ice cut her tender feet. The wind tugged at her white hair and her gown. At last she came to the blue mountain and stood facing the smooth stone teeth. The dark circular opening disgorged a long ladder, much longer than there could possibly have been room for in the egg. It soon extended to the foot of the blue mountain, and when the childlike Empress took hold of it, she saw that it consisted of letters which were fastened together. Each rung of the ladder was a line. The childlike Empress started climbing, and as she climbed from rung to rung, she read the words: turn back and go away. For come what will and come what may, never in any time or place must you and I meet face to face. To you alone, O childlike one, the way is barred, to you alone. Turn back, for never shall beginning seek the end of all. Shall and all don't really rhyme. Give me a break. The consequence of your intrusion can only be extreme confusion. However, it wasn't Michael End who wrote that because it was the translator. So I'm sure it rhymed in German. She stopped to rest and looked at, and probably each line is one word in German also, just because that's the way German is. She stopped to rest and looked up. She still had a long way to go. So far, she hadn't even gone halfway. Old man of wandering mountain, she said aloud, if you don't want us to meet, you needn't have written me this letter. It's your disinvitation that brings me. And she went on climbing. What you achieve and what you are is recorded by me, the chronicler. Letters unchangeable and dead freeze what the living did and said. Therefore, by coming here to me, you invite catastrophe. Thus is the end of what you once began. You will never be old, and I, old man, was never young. What you awaken, I lay to rest. Be not mistaken. It is forbidden that life should see itself in dead eternity. Again she had to stop to catch her breath. By then the childlike empress was high up, and the ladder was swaying like a branch in the snowstorm, clinging to the icy letters that formed the rungs of the ladder. She climbed the rest of the way. But if you still refuse to heed the warning of the ladder's screed, if you are still prepared to do what in time and space is forbidden you, I won't attempt to hold you back. Then welcome to the old man's shack. When the childlike empress had gone those last rungs behind her, she sighed and looked down. Her wide white gown was in tatters, for it had caught on every bend and crossbar of the message ladder. Oh well, she had known all along that letters were hostile to her. She felt the same way about them. From the ladder she stepped through the circular opening in the egg. Instantly it closed behind her, and she stood motionless in the darkness, waiting to see what would happen next. Nothing at all happened for quite some time. At length she said softly, "Here I am." Her voice echoed, as in a large, empty room. Or was it another, much deeper voice that had answered her in the same words? Little by little she made out a faint reddish glow in the darkness. It came from an open book which hovered in mid-air at the center of the egg-shaped room. It was tilted in such a way that she could see the binding, which was of copper-colored silk, and on the binding, as on the gem which the childlike empress wore around her neck, she saw an oval formed by two snakes biting each other's tail. Inside this oval was printed the title, The Never-Ending Story. Bastian's thoughts were in a whirl. This was the very same book that he was reading. He looked again. Yes, no doubt about it. It was the book he had in his hand. How could this book exist inside itself? The childlike empress had come closer. On the other side of the hovering book, she now saw a man's face. It was bathed in a bluish light. The light came from the print of the book, which was bluish green. The man's face was as deeply furrowed as if it had been carved in the bark of an ancient tree. His beard was long and white, and his eyes were so deep in their sockets that she could not see them. He was wearing a dark monk's robe with a hood, and in his hand he was holding a stylus with which he was writing in the book. He did not look up. The childlike empress stood watching him in silence. He was not really writing. His stylus glided slowly over the empty page, and the letters and words appeared as though of their own accord. The childlike empress read what was being written, and it was exactly what was happening at that same moment. The childlike empress read what was being written. You write down everything that happened, she said. Everything I write down happens, was the answer, spoken in the deep, dark voice that had come to her like an echo of her own voice. Strange to say, the old man of Wandering Mountain had not opened his mouth. He had written her words and she had heard them as though merely remembering that he had just spoken. Are you and I and all Fantastica? She asked. Are we all recorded in this book? He wrote, and at the same time she heard his answer. No, you've got it wrong. This book is all Fantastica, and you and I. But where is this book? He wrote the answer. In the book. Then it's all a reflection of a reflection, she asked. He wrote, and she heard him say, what does one see in a mirror reflected in a mirror? Do you know that, golden-eyed commander of wishes? The childlike empress said nothing for a while, and the old man wrote that she said nothing. Then she said softly, I need your help. Daniel, what are you doing? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? If you can hear me, leave a comment. Just joking. All right. Then she said softly, I need your help. I knew it, he said, and wrote. Yes, she said, I supposed you would. You are Fantastica's memory. You know everything that has happened up to this moment. But couldn't you leaf ahead in your book and see what's going to happen? Empty pages, was the answer. I can only look back at what has happened. I was able to read it while I was writing it, and I know it because I have read it, and I wrote it because it happened. The never-ending story writes itself by my hand. Then you know why I've come to you. No. And as he was writing, she heard the dark voice, and I wish you hadn't. But by my hand, everything becomes fixed and final. You too, golden-eyed commander of wishes, this egg is your grave and your coffin. You have entered into the memory of Fantastica. How do you expect to leave here? Every egg, she said, is the beginning of new life. True, the old man wrote and said, but only if its shell bursts open. You can open it, cried the childlike empress. You let me in. Your power let you in. But now that you're here, your power is gone. We are shut up here for all time. Truly, you shouldn't have come. This is the end of the never-ending story. The childlike empress smiled. She didn't seem troubled in the least. You and I, she said, can't prolong it, but there is someone who can. Only a human, wrote the old man, can make a fresh start. Yes, she replied, a human. Slowly, the old man of Wandering Mountain raised his eyes and saw the childlike empress for the first time. His gaze seemed to come from the darkest distance, from the end of the universe. She stood up to it, answered it with her golden eyes. A silent, immobile battle was fought between them. At length, the old man bent over his book and wrote, for you too, there is a borderline. Respect it. I will, she said, but the one of whom I speak, the one for whom I am waiting, crossed it long ago. He is reading this book while you are writing it. He hears every word we are saying. He is with us. That is true, she heard the old man's voice as he was writing. He too is part and parcel of the never-ending story, for it is his own story. Tell me the story, the childlike empress commanded. You, who are the memory of Fantastica, tell me the story from the beginning, word for word as you have written it. The old man's writing hand began to tremble. If I do that, I shall have to write everything all over again, and what I write will happen too. So be it, said the childlike empress. Bastian was beginning to feel uncomfortable. What was she going to do? It had something to do with him, but if even the old man of Wandering Mountain was trembling, the old man wrote and said, if the never-ending story contains itself, then the world will end with this book. And the childlike empress answered, but if the hero comes to us, new life can be born. Now the decision is up to him. You are ruthless indeed, the old man said and wrote. We shall enter the circle of eternal return from which there is no escape. Not for us, she replied, and her voice was no longer gentle, but as hard and clear as a diamond. Not for him, unless he saves us all. Do you really want to entrust everything to a human? I do. But then she added more softly, or have you a better idea? After a long silence, the old man's dark voice said, No. He bent low over the book in which he was writing. His face was hidden by his hood. Then do what I ask. Submitting to her will, the old man of Wandering Mountain began telling the never-ending story from the beginning. At that moment, the light cast by the pages of the book changed color. It became reddish, like the letters that now formed under the old man's stylus. His monk's habit and the hood also took on the color of copper, and as he wrote, his deep, dark voice resounded. Bastian too heard it quite clearly, yet he did not understand the first words the old man said. They sounded like Skublo Ridrak. Strange, Bastian thought. Why is the old man suddenly talking a foreign language? Or was it some sort of magic spell? The old man's voice went on, and Bastian couldn't help listening. This inscription could be seen on the glass door of a small shop, but naturally this was only the way it looked if you were inside the dimly lit shop, looking out at the street through the plate glass door. Outside it was a gray, cold, rainy November morning. The rain ran down the glass and over the ornate letters. Through the glass there was nothing to be seen but the rain-splotched wall across the street. Bastian was rather disappointed. I don't know that story, he thought. That's not in the book I've been reading. Oh well. It only goes to show that I've been mistaken the whole time. I really thought the old man would start telling the Neverending Story from the beginning. Suddenly, the door was opened so violently that the little cluster of brass bells tinkled wildly, taking quite some time to calm down. The cause of this hubbub was a fat little boy of 10 or 12. His wet, dark brown hair hung down over his face. His coat was soaked and dripping, and he was carrying a school satchel slung over his shoulder. He was rather pale and out of breath, but, despite the hurry he had been in a moment before, he was standing in the open doorway as though rooted to the spot. As Bastian read this and listened to the deep, dark voice of the old man of Wandering Mountain, a roaring started up in his ears, and he saw spots before his eyes. Why, this is all about him! And it was the never-ending story. He, Bastian, was a character in the book, which until now he had thought he was reading. And heaven only knew who else might be reading it at the exact same time, also supposing himself to be just a reader. And now Bastian was afraid. He felt unable to breathe, as though shut up in an invisible prison. He didn't want to read anymore. He wanted to stop. But the deep, dark voice of the old man of Wandering Mountain went on, and there was nothing Bastian could do about it. He held his hands over his ears, but it was no use, because the voice came from inside him. He tried desperately to tell himself, though he knew it wasn't true, that the resemblance to his own story was some crazy accident. But the deep, dark voice went on, and ever so clearly he heard it saying, "Where are your manners? If you had any, you'd have introduced yourself." "My name," said the boy, "is Bastian. Bastian Balthazar Bucks." In that moment, Bastian made a profound discovery. You wish for something you've wanted in it for You wish for something, you've wanted it for years, and you're sure you wanted it as long as you know you can't have it. But if all at once it looks as though your wish might come true, you suddenly find yourself wishing you had never wished for such a thing. That is exactly how it was with Bastian. Now that he was in danger of getting his wish, he would have liked best to run away. But since you can't run away unless you have some idea where you're at, Bastian did something perfectly absurd. He turned over on his back like a beetle and played dead. He made himself as small as possible and pretended he weren't there. He wasn't there. The old man of Wandering Mountain went on telling and writing the story of how Bastian had stolen the book, how he had fled to the schoolhouse attic and begun to read, and then Atreyu's quest began all over again. He spoke with Morla, the aged one, and Falcor in Yagramul's net beside the deep chasm, and heard Bastian's cry of fear. Once again he was cured by old Yurgul and lectured by Ingewuk. He passed through the three magic gates, entered into Bastian's image, and spoke with Eulala, and then came the wind giants and Spook City and Gamork, followed by Atreyu's rescue and the flight to the ivory tower, and in between everything that Bastian had done, how he had lit the candles, how he had seen the childlike empress, and how he had waited, lost my place, for him in vain. How she had waited for him in vain. Once again she started on her way to find the old man of Wandering Mountain. Once again she climbed the ladder of letters and entered the egg. Once again the conversation between her and the old man was related word for word. And once again the old man of Wandering Mountain began to write and tell the never-ending story. At that point the story began all over again, unchanged and unchangeable, and ended once again with the meeting between the childlike empress and the old man of Wandering Mountain, who began once again to write and tell the never-ending story. And so it would go on forever and ever, for any change of the sequence of events was unthinkable. Only he, Bastian, could do anything about it, and he would have to do something, or else he too would be included in the circle. It seemed to him that this story had been repeated 1,000 times, as though there were no before and after, and everything had happened at once. Now he realized why the old man's hand trembled. The circle of eternal return was an end without an end. Bastian was unaware of the tears that were running down his cheeks. Close to fainting, he suddenly cried out, "Moonchild, I'm coming!" In that moment, several things happened at once. The shell of the great egg was dashed to pieces by some overwhelming power. A rumbling of thunder was heard, and then the storm wind came roaring from afar. It blew from the pages of the book that Bastian was holding on his knees, and the pages began to flutter wildly. Bastian felt the wind in his hair and face. He could scarcely breathe. The candle flames in the seven-armed candelabrum danced, wavered, and lay flat. Then another, still more violent wind blew into the book, and the candles went out. The clock in the belfry struck 12. Chapter 13 is called Perilyn, the Night Forest. Who says we go on? Raise your hand if you want to keep going. Daniel says not me. Kimmy, what do you say? Kimmy says me. JJ raises his hand. I'm waiting for Rebecca. What? I heard about thumbs ups and hearts from Becca, but I don't see them. So we'll keep going. Chapter 13, Perilyn, the Night Forest. The first letter is M, and you can imagine what the first word is. The first two words. What on earth? Wow, where'd you get that? I don't know. Let's see. Yeah, it does. There.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
All right. So, chapter 13, Perilyn. I've got to wake up early for work. Okay. The comment says I have to wake up early for work. And chapter 13 is Perilyn the Night Forest. And that was actually a perfect time to put the Orin around my neck, by the way. You can't see it? Oop. We'll get it so that it, if we figure out a way to tie it, it'll work for the picture. Oh, she says, how long is the next chapter? Let's see. Page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 pages. Probably about 20 to 30 minutes. That's not too long. Okay, perfect. Oh, by the way, sorry. Whoa, where'd we go? Just a minute. I have to do this. You know I have to. There it is. All right. All right, because it's not too long with 2 O's. All right, so we will continue then. Chapter 13, Perilyn the Night Forest. Moonchild, I'm coming, Bastian repeated in the darkness. He felt something indescribably sweet and comforting flow into him from the name and fill his whole being. Flow into him from the name and fill his whole being. So he said it again and again, Moonchild, Moonchild, I'm coming, Moonchild, here I am. But where was he? He couldn't see the slightest ray of light, but this was no longer the freezing darkness of the attic. This was a warm, velvety darkness in which he felt safe and happy. All fear and dread had left him, ceased to be anything more than a distant memory. He felt so light and gay that he even laughed softly. Moonchild, where am I? He asked. He no longer felt the weight of his body. He groped about and realized that he was hovering in midair. The mats were gone, and there was no ground under his feet. It was a wonderful feeling, a sense of release and boundless freedom that he had never known before. He was beyond the reach of all the things that had weighed him down and hemmed him in. Could he be hovering somewhere in the cosmos? But in the cosmos there were stars, and here there was nothing of the kind. There was only this velvety darkness and a wonderful happy feeling he hadn't known in all his life. Could it be that he was dead? Moonchild, where are you? And then he heard a delicate bird-like voice that answered him, and that may have answered him several times without his hearing it. It seemed very near, and yet he could not have said from what direction it came. Here I am, my Bastian. Is it you, Moonchild? She laughed in a strangely lilting way. Who else would I be? Why, you've just given me my lovely name. Thank you for it. Welcome, my savior and my hero. Where are we, Moonchild? I am with you, and you are with me. Dream words, yet Bastian knew for sure that he was awake and not dreaming. Moonchild, he whispered, is this the end? No, she replied, it's the beginning. Where is Fantastica, Moonchild? Where are all the others? Where are Atreyu and Falcor, and what about the old man of Wandering Mountain and his book? Don't they exist anymore? Fantastica will be born again from your wishes, my Bastian. Through me, they will become reality. From my wishes? Bastian repeated in amazement. He heard the sweet voice reply, You know they call me the commander of wishes. What will you wish? Bastian thought a moment. Then he inquired cautiously, How many wishes have I got? As many as you want. The more the better, my Bastian. Fantastica will be all the more rich and varied. Bastian was overjoyed, but just because so infinitely many possibilities had suddenly been held out to him, he couldn't think of a single wish. I can't think of anything, he said finally. For a time there was silence, and then he heard the bird-like voice. That's bad. Why? Because then there won't be any more Fantastica. Bastian made no answer. He felt confused. His sense of unlimited freedom was somewhat marred by the thought that everything depended on him. Why is it so dark, Moonchild? He asked. The beginning is always dark, my Bastian. I'd awfully like to see you again, Moonchild, the way you were when you looked at me. Again he heard the soft lilting laugh. Why are you laughing? Because I'm happy. Happy, why? You've just made your first wish. Will you make it come true? He held out his hand and felt she was putting something into it. Something very small, but strangely heavy. It was very cold and very hard and dead. What is it, Moonchild? A grain of sand, she replied. All that's left of my boundless realm. I make you a present of it. Thank you, said Bastian, bewildered. What on earth could he do with such a gift, if at least it had been something living? As he was mulling it over, he felt something wriggling in his hand. He raised his hand to see what it was. Look, Moonchild, he whispered. It's glowing and glittering, and there, look, a little flame is coming out. No, it's not a grain of sand, it's a seed. It's a luminous seed. It's starting to sprout. Well done, my Bastian, he heard her say. You see how easy it is for you? Barely perceptible at first, the glow of the speck in Bastian's palm grew quickly, making the two child faces, so very different from each other, gleam in the velvety darkness. Slowly Bastian withdrew his hand, and the glittering speck hovered between them like a little star. The seed sprouted so quickly that one could see it grow. It put forth leaves and a stem and buds that burst into many-colored phosphorescent flowers. Little fruits formed, ripened, and exploded like miniature rockets, spraying new seeds all around them. From the new seeds grew other plants, but these had many different shapes. Some were like ferns or small palms, others like cacti, bulrushes, or gnarled trees. Each glowed a different color. Soon the velvety darkness all around Bastian and Moonchild, over and under them and on every side, was filled with rapidly growing luminous plants. A globe of radiant colors, a new luminous world hovered in the nowhere and grew and grew. And in its innermost center, Bastian and Moonchild sat hand in hand, looking around them with eyes of wonder. Unceasingly, new shapes and colors appeared. Larger and larger blossoms opened, richer and richer clusters formed, and all this in total silence. Soon some of the plants were as big as fruit trees. There were fans of long emerald green leaves, flowers resembling peacock tails with rainbow-colored eyes, pagodas consisting of superimposed umbrellas of violet silk. Thick stems were interwoven like braids. Since they were transparent, they looked like pink glass lit up from within. Some of the blooms looked like clusters of blue and yellow Japanese lanterns, and little by little, as the luminous night growth grew denser, they intertwined to form a tissue of soft light. You must give all this a name, Moonchild whispered. Bastian nodded. Carolyn, the night forest, he said. He looked into the childlike Empress's eyes, and once again, as at their first exchange of glances, he sat spellbound, unable to take his eyes off her. The first time she had been deathly ill, now she was much more beautiful. Her torn gown was whole again. The soft-colored light played over the pure whiteness of the silk and of her long hair. His wish had come true. Bastian's eyes swam. Moonchild, he stammered, are you well again? She smiled. Can't you see that I am? I wish everything would stay like this forever, he said. The moment is forever, she replied. Bastian was silent. He didn't understand what she had said, but he was in no mood to puzzle it out. He wanted only to sit there looking at her. Little by little, the thicket of luminous plants had formed a thick hedge around them. As though imprisoned in a tent of magic carpets, Bastian paid no attention to what was happening outside. He didn't realize that Pearlin was growing and growing, that each and every plant was getting big or bigger. Seeds no bigger than sparks kept raining down and sprouted as they hit the ground. Bastian sat gazing at Moonchild. He had eyes for nothing else. He could not have said how much time had passed when Moonchild put her hand over his eyes. Why did you keep me waiting so long? He heard her ask. Why did you make me go to the old man of Wandering Mountain? Why didn't you come when I called? Bastian gulped. It was because, he stammered, I thought all sorts of reasons. Fear, well, to tell you the truth, I was ashamed to let you see me. She withdrew her hand and looked at him in amazement. Ashamed? Why? Because, Bastian stammered, you must have expected somebody who was right for you. What's wrong with you? She asked. Aren't you right for me? Bastian felt that he was blushing. I mean, he said, somebody strong and brave and handsome, maybe a prince, anyway, not someone like me. He couldn't see her, for he had lowered his eyes, but again he heard her soft, lilting laugh. You see, he said, now you're laughing at me. There was a long silence, and when Bastian finally brought himself to look up, he saw that she was bending very close to him. Her face was grave. Let me show you something, my Bastian, she said. Look into my eyes. Bastian obeyed, though his heart was pounding and he felt dizzy. In the golden mirror of her eyes he saw, small at first as though far in the distance, a reflection which little by little grew larger and more distinct. It was a boy of about his own age, but this boy was slender and wonderfully handsome. His bearing was proud and erect, his face was noble, manly, and lean. He looked like a young prince from the Orient. His turban was of blue silk, and so was the silver-embroidered tunic which reached down to his knees. His high boots, made of the softest red leather, were turned up at the toes, and he was wearing a silver glittering mantle which hung down to the ground. But most beautiful of all were the boy's hands, which, though delicately shaped, gave an impression of unusual strength. I want to stop here and just the Prince from the Orient kind of struck me when I read it, because when we grew up in our American culture, the Orient to us means like China or something like that. But Michael End, having grown up in Germany, the Orient to there is like the Balkan Peninsula and Turkey, like Romania, kind of that area. So that's, I'm sure that's what the Orient, what he's thinking when he says the Orient. So we'll just continue now. Bastian gazed at the image with wonder and admiration. He couldn't get enough of it. He was just going to ask who this handsome young prince might be when it came to him in a flash that this was his very own self, his reflection in Moonchild's golden eyes. In that moment he was transported, carried out of himself, and when he returned he found he had become the handsome boy whose image he had seen. He looked down and saw exactly what he had seen in Moonchild's eyes, the soft red leather boots, the blue tunic embroidered with silver, the resplendent long mantle. He touched his turban and felt his face. His face was the same too, and then he turned toward Moonchild. She was gone. He was alone in the room, in the round room which the glowing thicket had formed. Moonchild! He shouted. Moonchild! There was no answer. Feeling utterly lost, he sat down. What was he to do now? Why had she left him alone? Where should he go? That is, if he was free to go anywhere, if he wasn't caught in a trap. While he was wondering why Moonchild should have vanished without a word of explanation, without so much as bidding him goodbye, his fingers started playing with a golden medallion that was hanging from his neck. He looked at it and let out a cry of surprise. It was Auron, the gem, the childlike empress's amulet, which made its bearer her representative. Moonchild had given him power over every creature and thing in Fantastica, and as long as he wore that emblem, it would be as though she were with him. For a long while Bastian looked at the two snakes, the one light, the other dark, which were biting each other's tail and formed an oval. Then he turned the amulet over and to his surprise found an inscription on the reverse side. It consisted of 4 words in strangely intricate letters. Do what you wish. There had been no mention of such an inscription in the Neverending Story. Could it be that Atreyu hadn't noticed it? But that didn't matter now. What mattered was that the words gave him permission, ordered him, in fact, to do whatever he pleased. Bastian approached the wall of luminous plants to see if he could slip through somewhere. To his delight, he found that the wall could easily be thrust aside like a curtain. Out he stepped. In the meantime, the night plants had kept on growing, gently but irresistibly, and Paralon had become a forest such as no human eye had ever beheld. The great trunks were now as high and thick as church towers, and still growing. In places, these shimmering milky white pillars were so close together that it was impossible to pass between them, and seeds were still falling like a shower of sparks. On his way through the luminous forest, Bastian tried hard not to step on the glittering seeds that lay on the ground, but this soon proved impossible. There simply wasn't a foot's breadth of ground from which nothing was sprouting. So he stopped worrying and went wherever the giant trees left a path open for him. Bastian was delighted on being handsome. It didn't bother him that there was no one to admire him. On the contrary, he was glad to have the pleasure all to himself. He didn't care a fig for being admired by the lugs who had always made fun of him. If he thought of them at all, it was almost with pity. In this forest, where there were no seasons and no alternation of day and night, the feeling of time was entirely different from anything Bastian had ever known. He had no idea how long he had been on his way, but little by little his pleasure in being handsome underwent a change. He began to take it for granted. Not that he was any less happy about it, but now he had the feeling that he had never been any different. For this there was a reason which Bastian was not to discover until much later. The beauty that had been bestowed on him made him forget little by little that he had ever been fat and bow-legged. Even if he had known what was happening, he would hardly have regretted the loss of this particular memory. As it happened, he didn't even realize that he had forgotten anything, and when the memory had vanished completely, it seemed to him that he had always been as handsome as he was now. At that point, a new wish cropped up. Being just being handsome wasn't as wonderful as he had thought. He had wanted to be strong, stronger than anybody, the strongest in the world. While going deeper and deeper into the night forest, he began to feel hungry. He picked off a few of the strangely shaped, luminous fruits and nibbled gingerly to see if they were edible. Edible was no word for it. Some were tart, some sweet, some slightly bitter, but all were delicious. He ate as he walked and felt a miraculous strength flowing into his limbs. In the meantime, the glowing underbrush around him had become so dense that it cut off his view on all sides. To make matters worse, lianas and aerial roots were becoming inextricably tangled with the thicket below. Slashing with the side of his hand as if it had been a machete, Bastian opened up a passage, and the breach closed directly behind him as if it had never been. On he went, but the wall of the giant tree trunks blocked his path. Bastian grabbed hold of two great tree trunks and bent them apart. When he had passed through, the wall closed soundlessly behind him. Bastian shouted for joy. He was the Lord of the Jungle! For a while he amused himself, opening paths for himself like an elephant that had heard the great call. His strength did not abate. He had no need to stop for breath. He felt no stitch in his side, and his heart didn't thump or race. But after a while he wearied of his new sport. The next thing he wanted was to look down on his domain from above to see how big it was. He spat on his hands, took hold of a liana, and pulled himself up hand over hand without using his legs, as he had seen acrobats do in the circus. For a moment, a vision, a pale memory of the past came to him of himself in gym class, dangling like a sack of flour from the bottommost end of the rope, while the rest of the class cackled with glee. He couldn't help smiling. How they would gape if they saw him now. They'd be proud to know him, but he wouldn't even look at them. Without stopping once, he finally reached the branch from which the liana was hanging, climbed up, and straddled it. The branch gave off a red glow. He stood up and, balancing himself like a tightrope walker, made his way to the trunk. Here again a dense tangle of creepers barred his way, but he had no difficulty in opening up a passage through it. At that height the trunk was still so thick that 5 men clasping hands could not have encircled it. Another somewhat higher branch, jutting from the trunk in a different direction, was beyond his reach. So he leapt through the air, caught hold of an aerial root, swung himself into place, made another perilous leap, and grabbed the higher branch. From there he was able to pull himself up to a still higher one. By then he was high above the ground, at least 300 feet, but the glowing branches and foliage still obstructed his view. Not until he had climbed to twice that height were there occasional spaces through which he could look around, but then the going became difficult because there were fewer and fewer branches, and at last, when he had almost reached the top, he had to stop, for there was nothing to hold on to but the smooth, bare trunk, which was still as thick as a telegraph pole. Bastian looked up and saw that the trunk or stalk ended some 50 feet higher up in an enormous glowing dark red blossom. He didn't see how he could ever reach it, but he had to keep going, for he couldn't very well stay where he was. He threw his arms around the trunk and climbed the last 50 feet like an acrobat. The trunk swayed and bent like a blade of grass in the wind. At length he was directly below the blossom, which was open at the top like a tulip. He managed to slip one hand between two of the petals and take hold. Then, pushing the petals wide apart, he pulled himself up. For a moment he lay there, for by then he was somewhat out of breath. But then he stood up and looked over the edge of the great glowing blossom as from the crow's nest of a ship. The tree he had climbed was one of the tallest in the whole jungle, and he was able to see far into the distance. Above him he still saw the velvety darkness of a starless night sky, but below him, as far as he could see, the treetops of Parolin presented a play of color that took his breath away. For a long time Bastian stood there, drinking in the sight. This was his domain. He had created it. He was the Lord of Parolin, and once again he shouted for joy. Chapter 14 is called The Desert of Colors. We're now about halfway through the book, just so you know, page 151 of 307. And we've finished 13 of 26 chapters. The first letter is N. So tomorrow we will begin with The Desert of Colors. So I hope you're enjoying the story, the never-ending story, that even though it just ended as the movie ended, now we're doing something new. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens to Bastian, and I hope that you're enjoying it. And God bless you. Have a good night. Good luck at work tomorrow, and we will see you tomorrow. And that's another story. God bless you. Good night.